Okay, so get better luck than I had last week. That would be great. Okay, so I'm going to break this one this week. The chapter 3 of the book is an article. It's originally an article I wrote for their house, and I realized since I was writing this meeting, that I was starting right in the middle of some topics that really required a long introduction, and I showed them in the middle of this. Not really the right introduction, and then I started figuring out how I'm going to teach this, so I can't teach without the introduction. So we're going to make it a two-part. We're going to make it right, chapter 3, a two-part class. And I apologize if this one is more basic than the other one. But on the other end, I realize that, as often happens, that my laziness and not going back and doing basic stuff means that I missed all sorts of interesting things. So I have all sorts of new discoveries for me, and we'll see if they're new to you as well. So I want to talk about. Let me start up what chapter 3 is, and then we'll talk about why. So chapter 3 is part of a broad thesis about politics in halakha, and the basic thesis is that the power to be strict and the power to be lenient tend to go together, and there's no way to have the power to be lenient if you don't also have the power to be strict. And that people often want to try to have their cake and not eat it too, I guess would be the way to frame it. So I usually start this one in a public lecture. I just start this with a joke that may work. Right, for the persona of a crusty mother of us, and then there are two things I can't stand about halakha these days. One is the way halakha is frozen, there's no innovation. Everything has to be exactly the way it was. The other is all the new chumrah. Good for you, right? To get immediately. Those are not compatible position. So if you, that's often what people want. We want innovations because we want innovations that create leniencies that we approve of, right? Get things out of our way, whether they're like the really crusty things. My father Shalom used to say, "Thank him, not Yom Tov," which really annoyed him. Like, any real basis for it? Why is it still there? People get annoyed that I suggest it's probably a type of different share. It might be. It might really be. There are certain things that originate from misunderstanding. So people don't find that more religiously edifying. But then more immediately, people want radical changes in marriages and things like that. And what I try to argue is, before we talk about the question of whether you're right about this or not, the real question is, could it be pulled off authoritatively? And the reasonable test of whether somebody can pull off a leniency authoritatively is, would you follow them if they try to stringency? And if you wouldn't follow them if they try to stringency, then they probably aren't going to have the authority to pull off a leniency. So there's usually a particular challenge to that, which is that there is a position which we'll see either the end of this week or the end of next week, among Achronim, that we don't have the power to make zerot that post-Talmudic. So if we don't have the power to make zerot, we don't have the power to impose new stringencies, then it's plausible to say, well, if we don't have the power to make new stringencies, we obviously don't have the power to make leniencies. And therefore, the whole conversation is over, and we get into halacha really is frozen. So the purpose of the article was to undermine the claim that we can't make new zerot, and to argue that there's no technical problem with making new zerot. That's what I want to get to next week. But in order to address that question, I think we have to first go back and try and figure out what exactly are the various ways in which rabbis can make decrees. It's not a uniform thing. And secondly, what are the sources of those various authorities? Then try and figure out what those various types of rabbinic legislation are, and what the sources of them are might tie into the question of whether we have authority to make them today. And then, if we can establish next week that is the possibility we still have authority to make them today, then we can also talk about, well, how far does our power extend to leniency as well as stringency. Okay, everything is clear. Okay, I should say first, when I first got this idea that rabbinic legislation is variegated, by reliable blessed memory. He would give a we're not give an annual in the basement from the your side of Philadelphia, his predecessor was vice president. It was, it was a big thing. Everyone had to everyone, the entire team would come and he would and then go back into your terrorism. But it was always an exciting day. The problem was Rabbi Lam, and so I guess I will leave nameless if they tell me is that you couldn't tell until about 2 days after the year whether what he had said made sense. Because he was such a good speaker. Right? Then he could just say, then of course a miracle occurred. Right? He would just say, oh yes, then a miracle occurred. Yeah, and 2 days later he would say, what? Then a miracle occurs is not the next stage in argument. So yeah, but in one of those shurim, I think one of those shurim, I think it might have been the early one. He said something which in retrospect was probably not. It was really cool at the time. There are many reasons. He was talking about the first in the machloket about where the three machloket in the first Mishnah as to how late you can say Kriyat Shema. The answer says until Shalosh Sha'ot, until 3, right? So Reeler says right till 3 of the night, right? Until midnight, and the Rabbi Neil says until Nishah. And in the end, we follow. We follow Rabbi, even though he's a minority. Rabbi tells his sons that they're allowed to follow his position, even though it's against the majority decision of the state. The question Rabbi addressed is why was he allowed to? Why didn't Rabbi have to tell them who had to follow the position of the state? So there's a fancy position which is at different spirits open. All sorts of really boring answers which we won't bother getting into. This really elaborate answer which he said. That the authority, that the idea that you can only say Kriyat until midnight, the it says, for the rabbis are not saying that that's how they understand the biblical text. The biblical text means all night, like Rabbi says, until but they're trying to prevent you sinning by saying by falling asleep and forgetting. Now, where do they get the authority to tell you that you're not allowed to say Kriyat? Let's take for now the extreme position which is associated with the student, a work called the students of Bnei Yonah, which he says that in fact the rabbi said that if you say Kriyat Shema at night after midnight, whatever midnight I don't think midnight is, then not only have you done the wrong thing, you actually haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. So what gives the rabbi the authority to just define you of the right of the right now allowed to say Kriyat Shema afterwards, you don't fulfill the mitzvah, right? Because they have authority. The answer is there's a verse. And the verse says, what's the verse that all of you right now? Where does everything come from? It's there on the first page of your search. You must pay again in bold, right? And most of the the Marsha Gita will tell you names. Illustrate for everything they tell you right away. Whereas if you look at the beginning of that paragraph, which I only gave you, the paragraph begins, if something is too hard for you, too wonderful for you, then you go to the grace section, and then you're obligated to follow their answer. So when Lam suggested, but what happens if you think that the verse is so obvious, there's not even a question for you? Well, like I said, if the great authority to make decrees comes from a verse which opens by which saying that you have to follow them when they respond to a question which is too hard, but then when the halacha is obvious, they have no right to make decrees. And that was what Rabbi Gamliel held. And Gamliel held that it was too obvious that the abuse was so obvious that there's no right to make decrees, and therefore he held there was no issue of majority versus minority because the minority only occurs after you agree that there's a fundamental issue, justiciable issue. Rabbi Gamliel held there was no justiciable issue at all because it was obvious that Kriyat Shema went all night and they had no right to make it till midnight. That is wrong because In fact, there's a dispute about what the verse means. But Eliezer says it means only until a third of the night. So to say that it's so obvious, they had to hold the Gamliel said Eliezer was so obviously wrong that you couldn't even. Okay, lots of very very elaborate moves. Am I allowed to say that I should have had alarm bells going off in my head saying, "Oh, that's maybe the miracle occurs." This version is so obvious that nobody could possibly think of anything to argue about, which is not likely to happen. But that's about But for all that, I don't. Forgot to start with. For all that, I don't find it convincing either. In general, I don't know that there's any other place in the literature where somebody has suggested, maybe there must be not support, but I haven't found it yet. Anybody who suggests in mind that the authority to make the decrees is limited by the right, it's inclusive where there was some issue of interpretation. And secondly, I don't know any of the notion that that was a verse which there is no question of interpretation is plausible on the face of it. Nonetheless, it opened up to me, this whole world, that the idea that there are different sources of authority for rabbinic sources. Yes. Yes, right. Great, right. We've much more fun than Rabbi Gamliel. Never cared about the majority, but he always just called it until. Yeah, many reasons. But this was not convincing. This was not a convincing share. But it was the first share I ever heard from my land. So, and I like the way, I guess, the chutzpah of saying there's a way in which you can just hold your opinion by saying the other people don't count at all. Because I deny their basis of authority. Right, so that was this is the kind of idea that people come up with often to explain the Judaism, Christianity is the majority religion, right? Why don't we say that all of the majority, right? These are all sorts of, right? So this kind of notion of finding ways to hold the right of a minority, fundamental principle majority rule, is valuable in all sorts of other things. Okay. So we're going to get to where the text of the Lamb side. So that obviously, in his view, right? Either the easy way is to hold that is to say that they think the verse is controversial, which is true. But we can have even by saying no, we think that they're better. Which is not a limitation. That's what we're going to. I'm going, even though I was not the last initial presentation. It was cool. It was really. It was productive. Rosenzweig likes to say, reality from the sometimes stuff that you're rubbing your 60 fire in one context, and you don't light a fire in this context. A spark shoots off something, like something else. That's something that happens in terror. You're definitely rubbing the 60 together in this again, and nothing happens in this again. A spark goes off, and all of a sudden something else lights up. It was worth the effort. Okay, so first number one is this possible source number one is this text, which I gave you a part in bold, which there's really lots, and because that's the only part that's used as subsequent sources, but really you can see that it goes through a lot of detail as to what sorts of cases you should bring. There's mention in the verse, which we're not going to get into, about whether you bring it to the priest or you bring it to the or the central part of the priest. All that gets settled halachically. All that matters to us is at the end of it is on the basis of the Torah, which they direct you. What the difference is in mishpat, who knows? Right? You have to act on, right? That's like a positive commandment, whatever they tell you to do. And then it says, "Lo tosur," then the barsha you stolen, don't stray. If they have a positive commandment and a negative commandment, you have to listen to it. Okay, but that might just mean you have to listen to whatever they tell you. Right, this part of Lamb is right. Now, never know what they tell you about what the Torah means. It doesn't necessarily that they have to, right, you have to listen to them when they say things because they think it's a good idea. Right? Torah, and this is because you have a question. Right? If it's just a matter of policy, where do they get that idea? Second question you have to address is this power absolutely limited to a Sanhedrin Hagadol in Jerusalem, sitting in the chamber of the Yom,
or does it apply to generations where there is no such central rabbinic authority? Right? This is a fundamental problem in Orthodox self-construction over the past 300 years. Right? Since the fundamental authority of Allah got challenged by the early Reform movement, the challenge was like, so what authority should rabbis have nowadays? Is the Great Sanhedrin, and there are many approaches to that, all of which are beyond that. And this year, you should be aware. Okay, so now how do we get this, or does this relate anyway to things beyond interpretation? So the Gemara about 23 is ask the question, what bracha do you make on Neirut Hanukkah? And the answer is, who sanctified his commandments and commanded us to light. But the problem is that nowhere in the Torah enough, right? Because Hanukkah happens after Tanakh. So there isn't any kind of prophetic text which can tell us you have to light. How can we say who sanctified his commandments and commanded us to do this? So Rav Avia says he commanded us from this verse, to illustrate what they tell you after. And then Rav Nehemiah says, no, it comes from Sha'al Avicha v'Yageta Zekineta v'Yomrula. Ask your father and your elders know. Okay, Rav Nehemiah pretty much is halachically, although it seems like an interesting claim. Of course, in context, Sha'al Avicha v'Yageta is talking about historical context, right? Probably, has anybody ever done something like this and things like that? So good reason to reject Rav Nehemiah's claim is halachic. On the other hand, it requires a Great Sanhedrin, but not such a big deal. We could ban a Great Sanhedrin. So all good. Okay, so here we have an extension, right? That the right to issue decrees comes from Moses' Torah, and if we want to extend the right to issue decrees, what else? We'll have to have the same problem we have extended over interpretation. Yeah. Ask your parents, and they'll tell you. The Torah tells you to command, ask your parents, they'll tell you. And we're just going to turn parents into Zakim. You can say Tzivon. No, you can say Tzivon. Well, yeah. Okay, so you want to put Rabbi Lamb's interpretation into this verse, right? Say, no, it's only if they ask you a question. Yeah, ask them generally what to do. What they tell you to do. No. Maybe I can't tell you much about the family because I say or they know he mostly vanishes. Okay, so for our purposes this week, we're going to just deal with the Rambam, and the Rambam he never shows right? You know, when you get to the university, you get to share, right? And there's your right. You can reclaim from it. Okay, so that extends it. Now it could be. Right? Now we haven't seen it, right? So intuitively we can make a distinction between interpretation and legislation. But right now, right? So we have no basis so far for distinguishing among kinds. Right? So, and maybe if they can create a discipline, say it's then they whatever they tell you have to do. But there seems to be there's a possibility that there's another kind. So let's take a look at it. One of my favorites. Right, so we said, great is your dignity, you're always going to be able to and then there's really no way to right. It gives away the sugya if you say a lotus essay. Right, so you're supposed to think all lotus essays, right? All do not. But in the end, the Gemara says it's as working off a prior statement which says that really whatever God says goes, human dignity is open against it. Said, so what are you doing here? Right, let's quote our proof text for that, which is an interesting interpretation of the verse. Of the verse is saying that everything counts as nothing against God. So Rav Cheses comes around Kana and says what they said in the human a specific biblical do not statement, and that is don't stray. Okay, so now human dignity overrides don't stray. At which point they laugh at it. And different ways to understand this, but I'm going to read it one of those ways. And they say, hang on a sec, there's no difference between that do not and any other do not. The command of do not stray, the biblical command. If human dignity pushes aside that biblical command, it should put no biblical command. You haven't solved their right. You haven't solved their problem at all. You haven't given them this. Rabbi says, says if the great man said something, don't listen to him. Why? Because all rabbinic matters asmechin on lo tasur. And because of human dignity, the rabbi is permitted. What is asmechin? Yeah. Right? They're hooked onto, right? They're leaning against. The verse is right, but it's not really good. Because the whole point is, right? You said this, there's no difference about the do not stray. It's just like all the other ones. No, it's different. So there isn't, because these things aren't really prohibited by do not stray. They're leaned against it. Now, if we say that do not stray is enough to enable you to say God commanded us, that sounds like you really are including it in the biblical category. So now it's so the only way to get out of this is to claim, well, you know what, there are some things that are included in that are included in the biblical category, and there's some things which are functioning in two different ways. Sometimes it really gives the rabbis the authority to say what the Torah means, even if they're legislating. And the Torah means do whatever the rabbis do. And sometimes there's this nebulous area connected to that biblical text isn't quite the same. Yeah.
Doesn't that make sense? Completely destroyed that distinction between Torah and Rabbanan forever.
Yes. Right. So now, from a historical perspective, and we'll see, right, it could be that the distinction between the and the Rabbanan is not inevitable and it's not built into halakha at all. Right? It could, right? It could be that at one point halakha, everything was deraita, and everything the rabbi said was in some sense interpretation. That's why would you make the distinction? And the category rabbinic is itself a rabbinic invention designed to create some kind of formal differences between their interpretations, but not actually distinguish in terms of authority. But the rabbis wanted to create an area of the law where if there was a doubt, you should be lenient to this thing. They said, we'll create this area of law called rabbinic, and that is the law. It actually has no different authority. We could construct a universe like that. Right, that's a whole, historians are fairly complicated, and we'll see, right? That, there's a statement, right, in the Yiddish Church Handbook, which we'll get to. And that's the third thing the men of the Great Assembly say is, don't make a hedge around the Torah. So that suggests that they're the first one to do it. If that means make rabbinic decrees, so that suggests that maybe there weren't any previous. Okay, they're going to be accepted. If Shlomo HaMelech decrees into Yadayim, we have to figure out how we fit those exceptions. But yeah, you're right. But the obvious problem, right? So from the first sugya, it sounds like there's no difference between rabbinic and biblical law because we see like that. And the second thing is no, it's really essential to preserve that difference. Some rabbinic things are attached to do not stray, but they're not really what the verse means. So what sort of authority do they have? Who has authority over them, right? What is this whole universe? Okay. Let's take a look at source fourth, and now we're going to find a third possible source, and this one does not disappear. Okay, so there's a verse in Vayikra which says, "Ushmartem et mishmarti." So that obviously, right, you're using the same shorah as shamar and shamar. So you should guard, right? You should be shomer, the thing which I guard, something like that. Is that right? There's a right. So what is it that we're supposed, or the thing, right? What is it that we're supposed to do? If we, right? It sounds like we're putting an additional guard, something that God has already put a guard around. So what does that mean? So the Gemara asks the following question: how do we know? Right? There are a whole. The Torah gives a list of relatives. It's incest. You have right example. But halacha includes a list of secondary relatives. The Gemara asks, "Remez l'shniyot min Torah v'ayim." Where do we get an idea in the Torah from the Torah itself that all these relationships which are not mentioned in the Torah also incest. So he really gives a clever answer that the scripture says because he had called it toivot, all those abominations the Canaanites did. So in general, whenever it says those, halacha says, those as opposed to others. So, right, so we say if the Canaanites did all those abominations, well, there must be other abominations. And probably it makes sense to say those abominations are the most severe ones, but there are other abominations that are a little bit softer. Right, so that, right, that's Rava's interpretation. That's how we get the secondary. But now, I'm really about Rabbi Safra's question. No, actually, right? Actually, that sounds like a biblical. That sounds like a biblical interpretation. So, right, what you're not right. You're not. Then it shouldn't be. The answer is you're right. So there's your about it. Right, it's biblical, but it's a rabbinic interpretation. Okay, which the answer is what? All things in Torah require, right? That doesn't create a distinction. You want to find a way in which these secondary relations are not quite the same as the primary relations in terms of incest. You haven't done that because claiming that it's rabbinic interpretation of Torah is what we mean by Torah. Which the answer is say, Ela midrabana ukra asmachta be'alma. Okay, so now really they're just rabbinic, and this verse, Mishmarti, is the peg on which we hang rabbinic decrees. Okay, I thought Lo Tasur was the thing on which we hung rabbinic decrees. Now we have a second story. Is this the same kind of decree as the other? Right? How does this relate to Hanukkah? How does it relate to whatever decrees it is that the rabbis permit in order, right, in the case of human dignity? Okay, so now we have two verses in play, and we have three cases. We have Hanukkah and other mitzvot like Hanukkah. We make that bracha on Megillah, possibly Halal Rosh Chodesh, which is already. We'll see showing up. Halal generally, and then we have the kind of general decrees that can be relaxed because of human dignity. We don't know what those are, but there are a lot of decrees that can be relaxed. Let's say, for example, walking through a field in which a corpse was once buried, and we don't know if there are still enough pieces of the corpse left to create tumah. Right, so that's right. So in order to not have a mourner of the Kohen walk alone, you can accompany a Kohen. A Kohen can walk with them. Have the mourner walk alone. The Kohen can walk through that kind of field with them, even though normally it's rabbinic violation. Right, so that sounds like the standard thing we call Rabbanon. You're not right. Kohen are not allowed to walk through cemeteries. This might or might not be a cemetery, right? So so that's a doubtful thing. And then we have this special category. I don't know whether it's special or not, which is the secondary kind of incestuous relationship. And they might have different sources, they might have the same source. All right, we have two verses. Okay, one other Gemara. Now that's the end of the Gemara. Now we're getting on it. One is just talking about this, that what Mishnah about 1:1, where the Great Assembly say, make a fence. And in its commentary to the Mishnah said, what is the fence around the Torah? What this means are the Gzirot and Takanot, which distance a person from transgression. That means all the rabbinic decrees that distance a person from transgression. And he quotes a verse, and he quotes our verse. This one, not Lo Tasur. Because the Maimonides say there's a category of things called siag or fence. And those things seem like, which he says, are intended to distance a person from sin. And those things which are intended to distance a person from sin, they come from Mishmartemet Mishmarti and not from Lo Tasur. Okay, if we're in Rabbi Lamb's fancy thing, right? So this is the proof that somebody could have derived the prohibition against saying Kriyash after midnight from this verse, which is not dependent on questions. In fact, the language they were figured that down in Avera, we all know is exactly what Rabbi Gamaliel says. In the first mission, that's right, we can time it. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Lo kasur sounds like. So it's the same thing. Sometimes the is reference to rabbis. And lo kasur is argument. Okay, so that's an excellent, right? Excellent. We could distinguish it and say that that Talmudists have to listen from lo kasur. Rabbis have to tell them things that they have to listen to, right? Because it's Shmartani Shmarti. I guess that'd be an interesting read of Rambam to compromise it. The Rambam here is just explaining why did the men of the Great Assembly tell theirs, right? Say we have to make fences around the Torah because we have a verse that tells us we have to do it, and then why do you have to listen? You have to listen because of a different verse. That would be very cool. That would be very cool.
Now we make it with Rambam refers to or anywhere.
Yeah, we're going to go through all the Rambam. We're going to go through all the Rambam, but that's right. That's a very nice possibility. Sure. Okay. So we are just right now, as Maimonides quotes one of the verses, not the one we would have expected. He quotes it in general, Gzera and Takanot, even though the Gemara only quoted it about the specific case of the secondary incestuous relationships. Marty has an interesting way of reconciling them. Let's go on and see if we can sustain it. All right, so we'll turn on to verse 7. So we just read Maimonides' introduction to Maimonides' commentary to Mishnah Avot. Now we're going to read his introduction to the overall Mishnah. In his introduction to the overall Mishnah, the Rambam talks about 5 kinds of laws that are set out in post-biblical halachic collections, right, or tradition. The first is what he calls halakha Moshe Sinai, which are things that have no scriptural basis at all. The second are things that are mikubal in Moshe Sinai, and those are things which are interpretations of the Torah that go back to Moses. Okay, this is not usually done much outside of the context of studying Rambam, so it's worth making the distinction again. Halakha Moshe Sinai for him means things that go back to Moses and have no basis in text at all. They're the things that God whispered into Moses' ear at Sinai. Here's the Torah, and by the way, here are a few others. Still have to be black and square, right? Why they are, no one ever knows, like why those things, right, got left out of the Torah and just got put in, but there they are, right? They're not like you would think like to be really big things. No, still have to be black and square. Maybe still have to be black and square somehow changes the universe in right in really dramatic ways. Okay. The second row is a separate category of the fundamental halachic meaning of the biblical verse, and there he which he thinks also is is a tradition going back to Sinai, that there's always a fundamental meaning of the verse that it should not be subject to dispute because it should be live tradition. He claims there's no then everyone tries to figure out like how do you explain all the in these 2 categories. He claims there's no dispute, and everyone tries desperately to explain thousands of exceptions. I think it's famously Chabot year 192, I think, that tries to go through the exceptions one by one and explain why none of the things which sound like they're saying they're this are really that. And so in the end, Maimonides' principle is intact, but he has no example. Right? Anything which would be one of those 2 things, right, is okay. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but yeah. I don't know how you resolve it, but many efforts to resolve it. The third category are things that are derived not where the interpretation of the Torah is not a function of tradition, but a function of analysis, and specifically a function of the formal rules of exegesis, right? So we always talk about the 13 Midot of Rabbi Ishmael because we read those in davening every day, but right, probably some of you know, right, that those are not actually the rules we use, right? Because there's a dispute between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, and those are Rabbi Ishmael's rules, but we pass on like Rabbi Akiva, we use a totally different system. Nonetheless, Rabbi Akiva didn't write a cool Mishnah, right? So everyone still recites Rabbi Ishmael's rules from memory, but just the halakha follows Rabbi Akiva's rules. Now ask me, can you tell me the difference between Rabbi Ishmael's rules and Rabbi Akiva's rules? No, because we don't really understand either of them terribly well enough, let alone the difference. Right? There's very subtle differences between whether your basis is klal ufrat or your basis is riboy and miyut. People, that'd be a whole separate course to try and see if it was possible to recover what they mean. Okay. The fourth category, right? Here we go. Right. The fourth category these are the laws that the prophets and sages of every generation established as a fence or hedge for the Torah. And here again, he says, these are the laws that Hashem commanded us to do generally when he said, Shomer my Mishnara. So he thinks that these kinds of laws that are established as a fence or a hedge, they come from the verse in Vayikra, not from Lo Tasur. And these are the laws that Chazal call Gzerot. Okay, the things that Chazal call Gzerot come from Mishmeret Lemishmarti. And then he says something really interesting. He says, look, whether you can cook chicken and milk, that's a classic Gzerah. You can't cook, right? Should be able to cook chicken and milk? Well, the reason we don't let you cook chicken and milk is because we're afraid if we allow you to cook chicken and milk, we'll let you, right, you'll come to cook beef and milk. That's a classic rabbinic Gzerah. But he says, you know what? I think we have to read the side is really important. He says, but some among them did not favor this Gzerah. And there were rabbis who, right, there were among the rabbis people who said, what? Why would people be more likely to confuse chicken with beef than fish? If everyone knows the difference. There's no prohibition, right? There's no prohibition against cooking fowl and milk. Why would anyone, right? So why would anyone think that, right? Because I can cook fowl and milk, I can cook beef. Yes.
What I find interesting too is that is that even if you were to eliminate the risk, somehow you were to say we confuse chicken society where they're not comparable, no one's confusing them. Even then,
Let's not assume that shrimp honey means that yet.
Okay.
Okay, you're reading ahead. Good for you. But let's get there first. Okay, I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet. Okay. So he says, right. So the Chachamim forbade right, chicken and milk, so in order to keep you separate from the real forbidden thing, which is cooking, which is eating or cooking beef and milk. But there were among them some who were not convinced by this Gzera. How do we know this? Because Rabbi Yossi Aglili allowed, right? Rabbi Yossi Aglili is that right? He allowed cooking chicken and milk, eating chicken and milk. All right, all fine. And in the place of Yossi Aglili, right, in the place of Yossi Aglili, they followed his position. Okay, now here's the fascinating thing: is you could have easily said, I think until I read this, I always understood it this way. The halacha about whether chicken and milk was right is forbidden or not was decided 1,000 years before Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And then they had a fight about what the halacha was. And like all other halachic fights, right? So in the place, right? So when they were arguing about what the past halacha was, so you can follow your Rav and you can follow your Rav. But Maimonides doesn't seem to read it that way. What he says is that this was a live dispute about whether to make, not whether there had been a decree, but whether there was a decree. And because Rabbi Yossi, right,
say that distinction again.
That the difference between, let's say, right, Rabbi Sapir and I could have an argument, right, about whether it's rabbinically prohibited to use COVID tests on Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but we're arguing about what the law in the past was. We're not arguing about whether to forbid it.
Mm-hmm.
We're arguing about whether it's forbidden by past law. So that's what I would have thought the dispute between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and the rabbis about chicken and milk is. Right? They all agreed there was a past law, and they just disagreed about what it was. And then there'd be nothing exceptional about being able to follow Rabbi Yossi Aglili in his place, because okay, right, you follow your rabbi unless there's a vote. But the way the Rambam sets it out is there was a live dispute about whether to make this decree. Rabbi Yossi Aglili dissented from the initial decree, and because he dissented from the initial decree, his space was exempt from it. He agreed that perhaps the decree applied everywhere else, because those rabbis had made a decree. But he didn't make the decree, so it didn't apply in his place. So that to me is a radical idea, right? So what happens to majority rule? And so we can always solve the problem of majority rule by saying that they didn't take a vote. Right? Majority rule only applies basically halachically. That creates all sorts of issues for us in modernity. We're not as to how we have to create some kind of fictional vote or implicit vote. Yeah. Right. We have to all do that. But the simple solution is that majority rule applies only once there's a vote. But until there's a vote, it sounds like Maimonides says, you can make decrees that are local. And they're binding, but they're only binding on the places where the decree is where the rabbis of that place agree, and that suggests that the authority to make decrees is not in any way dependent on the Great Sanhedrin. Because the Great Sanhedrin would be a centralized meeting which have a vote, and then we should follow the majority rule, and it should apply everywhere. So it seems to me that Maimonides here is explicitly creating, right, creating space for that the authority to issue decrees is not dependent on the Great Sanhedrin at all, and yet it still comes from, it seems, from Mishmeret Mishmarti. Yes, then.
Is it fair to use the phrase authority issue decrees in both cases?
Well,
What you're describing, it sounds a little more like if the authority to issue universal decrees versus the authority to issue local decrees.
well, so the way I'm reading this section out is, right, he just said there's a general category called Zerot, and then he says, well, some of those Zerot, and he says there can be disputes about that. And he lists a whole bunch of disputes which I didn't bother including. And he says, look, and sometimes the right to dispute is live, but he doesn't say that's a new category. He just includes it as part of the general category of Zerot, which he derives from Mishmeret Mishmarti. So I'm arguing that he doesn't see it as fundamentally different. Right? He just sees that you have authority over whom you have authority of. The last line says, right, when everybody agrees, so then it's universal. And when not everybody agrees, so then it's wherever your authority extends to. Right? That's what I want to argue about. I think he opens up a whole universe here. You have to buy it. That's that, right? So you can all go home and read it again and see if I'm right. Right? But I want to argue that the way he reads it is that right. The key line is mehem mishlo near 8 log zerasu. There were some for whom that making this decree did not seem fit. Right? Not that they didn't hear about the decree, not that they didn't think it had been made, but this decree did not seem correct to them. To me. Okay, but then Maimonides then puts in another, right? It says, by the way, but this doesn't use up the category of rabbinic decrees. It says there's a fifth category of law, and these are the laws. He says shenasu b'derech ha'iyun l'hasdarat inyanim shebein bnei adam. So we should realize that we're dealing with a Hebrew translation of the Arabic text. So I can't give you I was sloppy. I didn't look up all the translations to see what's happening here. I assume this is the Kafa translation, which is the later translation, the modern translation, and of the generally assumed to be that of the last version of the Mishnah of the commentary of the Mishnah. And Maimonides begins writing the commentary of the Mishnah when he's a teenager. He's still editing it at the end of his life. And we have a manuscript which we believe is his imitation of it, and you can see that over time, if this is correct, that he changes it to match his later positions as he develops positions in the Mishnah Torah. He changes the commentary of the Mishnah to match that, but he doesn't get them all. So there's still leftover places where he forgot to change them. It's a really interesting intellectual history thing. Okay, but it's right. So, but I haven't checked at least at this last stage. He says there's another category of law, and this category says that they're not made. They're made b'derech ha'iyun l'hasdarat aninim she'ein bnei adam davar she'ein bo hosafa al divrei Torah lo giraon. So they're not related directly, I think, in any way to existing biblical laws. They're not like decrees which are designed to protect an existing biblical law. These are general attempts to organize society and arrange interpersonal matters. They're not right? They're just rabbinic ideas of what good legislation would be. So there's an interesting language, right? Tikkun ha'olam, which we all think we know what that means, and then binyanei hadat. Right? So somehow, right, ways in which it's necessary for halacha, religious halacha, to work properly. You need to move things around somehow. Like, for example, the decree that you can't allow husbands to invalidate a get that they sent to their wife, not in the presence of the agent that they sent, because that way the wife ends up thinking she's divorced and she's not, and she ends up remarrying. Right. So that even though there's nothing in the law which says that doesn't work, you can't do that because it messes up the world. Right there. Right. If the system is, and those are things the sages call takanot min hagot as opposed to gzerot. There's that word again. You can't ever violate them. whether that means that the Risafra is addressed under any circumstances, or in light of the previous thing, even if you disagreed with their purpose. Here's a new chain. No rabbis. They have a consensus of the population associated with them. Now here he doesn't mention any kind of subcategory of things that are accepted by some places and not others. Does that mean it doesn't exist? Places. So we know that, right, that we have all sorts of decrees by cities upon each other, local populations upon each other, right? So it sounds like there's maybe we could fit that in also, and there are decrees but these decrees are not a function of rabbinic power, they're a function of popular acceptance. Pardon? Probably not. Probably not, right? It requires consent of the decree. Yeah. But if there's some kind of universal consensus, then nobody can find their way out of it. Okay, and then he quotes another verse. If you break a fence, you'll get bitten by a snake. So, right. So that sounds like very consistent. This depends entirely on popular acceptance. So it has no, it has no real rabbinic authority behind it at all. But now, what are the parameters between this and the Gzerot he said earlier? How do these relate to the kind of mitzvot he talked about? Right? Is this what Ner Chanukah is? Or is Ner Chanukah a third category entirely? It's not a Gzerah. It's not, right? It's a mitzvah. We can say there really are three kinds of categories, right? There are Gzerot, there are Takanot Minhagot, and there are mitzvot. And mitzvot maybe come from, right, well, from Lo Tasur, and Gzerot might come from Lo Tasur, or might come from Ushmartan Ishmarti, and then these things which come from nowhere. Yes, Raisa.
Yeah, I think I was reading this. Thinking about it, we are like, so it's the idea that not traditionally what we think of mitzvah halakha, it's other things. That's a good idea.
Interesting. That could be Das Torah, but Das Torah was consent to the government.
Right. It's like it's sort of a Das Torah of how we practice milk and meat.
Yeah, no, I think what you're right is that it's a kind of authority that is not related to pre-existing formal halakha. So it has to be related to some kind of broad sense of values. Right? And I think you're right. So that's a big thing. That that if you want to run a society, then you have to somehow give authority. Now you can say, what, that authority doesn't relate to rabbis, that authority relates to elected officials. And he doesn't tell you it's rabbis here, right? Right. He just said there's this thing called takanot minhagot that get their authority because of popular acceptance. Well, he quotes.
What might be an example?
Well, be an example. So I talked about the prohibition against husbands, right? The idea that you have to support the poor of the Gentiles together with the poor of the Jews, because maybe that's dark shalom, but maybe that's also tikkun olam. Sumptuary laws, right? So let's say, you can't spend too much on a simcha because that imposes too much costs, social costs on the poor, all sorts of things like that. The thing is, they're malleable because you could always claim, that's just an extension of Tzedakah and Gemuruch Chasadim, right? But he seems to think that there's a separate category. Okay, so I want to set up for you, right, that we can divide the authority for non-D'oraita law, let's say, right, and not just minhag, right? We're not just talking about self-accepted private customs, right, but binding law, right? You can talk about at least three different kinds. You can talk about the establishing positive religious commandments. You can talk about extending prohibitions to protect the biblical. Then we can talk about what Rabbi Sauer calls Das Torah. Right, just the authority to generally organize a society properly, and then we'll have to ask for each of those, right? So, if we want to run a society properly now, an Orthodox society, a Halachic society, so what degree of those authorities do we need? Okay, so let me give you one other example, then we'll finish. Right, anyone wants to go to Mark, right? In And maybe this will take 3 classes, which is good. Thank you. I learned, questions were great, and I'm still learning. And this is just Rambam. Like, I'm gonna try not to complicate it. Legal systems, the function needs to be, right, there need to be ways in which they can adapt to these circumstances. Otherwise, you get, right, that I think is a given. The only question is how you do it. And sometimes, because you're making a point about not having authority, you'll make things a little clunkier. So there's a classic clunky workaround in halacha, which is that there's certain kinds of law that can only be done by people with real smicha. Real smicha means that Moses put his hands on somebody, and that somebody put his hands on you. Right, that's right, and said you have the authority to shall with two other people who made or may not have smicha, with all that sort of thing, right? Everyone agrees that real smicha died out somewhere before the medieval period. Right, it's just gone by then. An attempt to recreate it in the 16th century, but it's gone but it doesn't work, so it's gone. What do we do? What do we do with area? Right? For example, you can't judge cases of theft unless you're a samurah. What do we do? Are we really going to run a society in which you can get away with theft because we can't judge cases of theft? Anybody know what the solution is? The solution is Gemara calls a thing called shlichus sayhu ka'avdina, which means that we hypothesize that the last samach, just before disappearing from the world, appointed all subsequent rabbinic generations as his agents to judge all such cases. And so we can still judge such cases, but only we judge them as agents and not as independent beings. Now that creates all sorts of clunkiness, right? Many clunkiness and many different Torah are given about what are the things we can and can't do as an agent. And we didn't do this for everything. We say only for things that are essential, right? So we let some things go into abeyance and not other things. That's an example. Like this is a massive clunky workaround, right? You have to create, which is totally unconvincing, but right. So the question, so the question is how essential is the capacity to make decrees, and do we think that it just functions as it always did, or do we have to come up with clunky workarounds? And we come up with clunky workarounds, right? What kind of limitations will those clunky workarounds put on us? Right. So that's the question I want to be addressing at this point, perhaps in a week and a half. Last week, halfway through it, 2 weeks. So maybe a week. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much again. Yeah. Hold on, Sir. I'll make more.